Brian Mudd Show is on News Radio 610 WIOD.
We have talked a lot about governments and how far they can go, how far they should go regarding COVID restrictions. What about your employer, though? We've seen numbers of employers that have also taken some liberties in kind of mandating personal behavior. For example, well, we'll let people back in the office, but only under these specific conditions and only if you're engaged in this kind of behavior and that type of thing. So what is legal and what isn't? Here to talk about what your employer can mandate, especially during the holidays, Quentin Brogdon, attorney once again, is joining us from Crain Brogdon Rogers. And, well, Quentin, let's talk about the employers. You know, first, when you talk about employment, I know about character clauses. So, for example, most employers, as a term of agreement to work there, if you do something in your personal life which reflects negatively on the organization, well, that can be, you know, a condition of termination pretty much without questions asked. But when it comes to personal behavior around the virus pandemic, how far can employers go?
Good morning, Brian. Well, you first have to begin with looking at what kind of job you're talking about. If you're talking about a nurse or somebody who's working in an assisted living home, there's going to be much more leeway given to the employer because of the nature of the job. It's a high-risk job sort of by definition. If you're talking about somebody in retail or somebody who sits behind a desk all day, you know, you're looking at a different kettle of fish. You also look at OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It imposes a general duty on employers to provide a safe workplace. So employers have to take reasonable steps to protect their employees from other employees and from the public. But, you know, the devil's in the details. How do you play that out? And people are giving up and having to give up a whole lot of freedoms in the face of this pandemic, and there's quite a bit of frustration right now out there generally.
How much of a role does social media play in this conversation? In other words, people posting what they're doing and that personal behavior may be being viewed by employer, being called into question.
You know, there's a whole series of cases that sort of outline the contours of what employers can do with information that they find on social media. If I'm a member of the American Nazi Party and I'm blasting that proudly on my social media, probably my employer can get rid of me without any fear of legal issue. You know, anybody can file a lawsuit, but I can't see the employer prevailing. It gets a little dicier, though, if I post social media and I'm in a crowd that's larger than the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, says I'm supposed to be in, and I'm not wearing a mask. Can an employer then restrict me or terminate me or fine me or do something else? And the answer probably is yes, unfortunately. I know many of your listeners won't want to hear that, but, you know, given this pandemic, you know, it's really in the eye of the beholder. Different judges have come out different ways on these issues. You balance the health considerations of the public versus the freedoms that are being given up. But there's no question everybody's giving up a whole group of freedoms that we never thought we'd ever have to give up.
Yeah, Quentin, from an employer side, let's talk about small businesses, for example, or perhaps managers. What do you think is good policy to set to the extent that employers engage in anything along the lines of restrictions and mandates?
It's always best from an employer's point of view, and I would submit to you from an employee's point of view, to try and get people to buy in and do things voluntarily. You know, there's been a lot of talk about vaccines and whether employers or the government can require them. Most people agree it's best if people in general want to take the vaccine, for example, believe it's safe, and voluntarily take it. If you're cramming requirements and different things down the throats of your employees, you're going to have rebellion. You're going to have people acting out. You're going to have people saying, I'm just not going to do that. So your best route always as an employer is to try and get voluntary buy-in from your employees.
So about that, and there are a number of corporations in particular, I don't know necessarily about smaller businesses, but a number of corporations that have kind of gone through best practices, safety training, and then you have to certify that you're going to adhere to all of those standards. That is basically coercion to agree at that particular point with whatever the specifics are. Do you think that's questionable practice?
Well, it's going to be in the eye of the beholder, in the eye of the specific judge, and you've had different judges come down on restrictions of freedoms in different ways. It's a balancing test. You balance public health and safety and the safety of the employees versus the restrictions and the freedoms they're giving up. And how much weight do you give the pandemic? Depending on how much weight you give that, that's where I think you're getting different outcomes by different judges. Some judges have bought into the idea that the pandemic justifies pretty much giving up almost any freedom in the name of public health. Other judges are more cautious and raising a concern. Justice Samuel Alito, for instance, from the United States Supreme Court, gave a speech a couple weeks ago, and he was decrying the unprecedented loss of freedoms that we're all being asked to engage in, and saying, this is a constitutional stress test for the country.
Quentin Brogdon, always appreciate the analysis. And again, he's with Crain Brogdon Rogers.